Did you know that George Washington started a world war? No? Well, let's go to the beginning of the story. It is early 1753 and Washington has just been appointed to lead one of the 4 Virginia militia districts by the Virginia Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie. This position suited the 20-year-old Washington as he had grown up listening to stories of his Indian fighting great-grandfather and watched his older half-brother Lawrence serve in a Virginia company. These men would be idealized by the young George Washington, who relished the opportunity to prove himself in the Virginia militia. The only problem was that George had zero military experience, which wouldn't actually be a problem. Yet. Washington's appointment as a commander in the Virginia militia coincided with a complicated geopolitical issue between 2 great powers at the time, Great Britain and France. By 1753, North America, or at least most of it, had been split largely between France and Britain. As any history fan would know, Great Britain and France do not have a long history of being friendly with each other, and eventually the 2 colonial neighbors found many issues to disagree about. But the most important issue for our story today was the Ohio River Valley. This valley was extremely lucrative to whoever could control it. The land was filled with Native American tribes that were all too willing to trade with the Europeans, and combined with the valley's natural resources, the British and French both desperately claimed the valley as their own. The French decided to press their claim by asserting their authority over the local Native American tribes. They ordered the tribes to refuse trade with any other trader that was not French or suffer the consequences. In June of 1747, the French became increasingly frustrated at the reports of British influence being extended into the Ohio Valley, and local tribes participating in trade with British traders. The French felt that they had to do something to assert their authority. New France's Governor General, and prepare yourself for this terrible pronunciation, Roland Mitchell Baron de la Galissonière, ordered Pierre-Joseph Céloron to lead 200 French colonial troops into the Ohio Valley to remind the Native Americans and British traders who owned the valley. After marching for hundreds of miles, Céloron's troops finally arrived at the major Native American settlement of Logstown, located in what is today Pennsylvania. Céloron was angered to see Logstown flush with goods from British traders and demanded that the Native Americans cease trading with the British immediately. The local people informed Céloron that the French did not own the Ohio Valley. They did, and that they would trade with whoever they liked, whether the French approved or not. Céloron was furious, but knew he was powerless to enforce French rule with the modest size of his force, so he continued south, where he encountered more and more native tribes trading with the British, and all chose to ignore Céloron and his troops. Disgusted, Céloron was forced to admit defeat and headed back to Montreal, but the French would not back down that easily. The French returned in 1752 with 300 Indian allies, and attacked the Native American village of Pickawillinie for being one of the villages that refused Céloron's orders to cease trading with the British. Here, the French made an example of what happened to Native Americans who ignored French orders. The French captured 3 British traders, murdered 14 Miami Indians, including the Miami chief, who the French's Indian allies boiled and cannibalized in front of the survivors of Pickawillinie. The French then burned the village and left. Following the destruction of Pickawillinie, the British ignored the French's attempt at a show of force and continued their trading with the Native Americans living in the valley. Realizing that they needed to do more, the next spring the French decided to escalate their claim in the Ohio Valley by sending an expedition of 2,000 troops to the region, and began constructing a series of forts along the route that Céloron had taken years earlier. As his force moved south, the French forcibly expelled any British trader they encountered, causing the British to fear for any future investment into the area. This is where George Washington steps in. The governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, was determined to protect Virginia's claim in the Ohio Valley and ordered the 21-year-old Major George Washington to approach the French and deliver a letter ordering the French to leave the valley to the French commander. The French commander, Jacques Lagourdier de Saint-Pierre, learned of Washington's approach and invited Washington to a generous dinner. While the 2 men shared a meal, Washington delivered the letter to Saint-Pierre, to which Pierre refused. Pierre argued that the British had no authority over the Ohio River Valley, and thus was unable to order the French to do anything in the area. With this, Washington left the French camp and headed back to Virginia, certain that war was inevitable. While Washington was dining with St. Pierre, Dinwiddie took further action to secure the valley for the British. He ordered William Trent to take a small company of about 40 men to build a fort on the strategic site where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers converge, the same site where Pittsburgh is today. When Washington returned to Dinwiddie, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and ordered him to take the 300-strong Virginia regiment to reinforce William Trent at the fort they were busily constructing. Meanwhile, back at the British fort, on April 16, 1754, a French force of about 500 men arrived and forced the British to leave. The French then continued work on the fort and renamed it to Fort Duquesne. When Washington arrived, he encountered 1,000 Frenchmen nearing completion of their fort. Hopelessly outnumbered, Washington decided to set up camp in a nearby meadow while he awaited British reinforcements. While Washington waited, some of his Indian allies reported seeing a French force marching through the wilderness nearby. The Indians warned that this French force of about 50 men were planning to attack Washington's men at an opportune time, so Washington decided to take the initiative. On May 27th, Washington took 40 men and marched them 5 miles through thick wilderness under the cover of night and searched for the French force. The next morning, Washington's men found the French, but what happened next is shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that 15 minutes after Washington encountered the French, at least 10 French were dead, and the rest were either wounded or captured. What Washington probably didn't know was that the French force was not a hostile one, but instead a diplomatic entourage on its way to Washington to deliver a letter that was demanding Washington to leave the area. Washington and his men had just slaughtered a diplomatic party of a nation that was not at war with Washington's. As you can expect, France did not take kindly to this event. When they had discovered the corpses left behind at the French camp, the French immediately organized a force of 600 men and sent them to exact revenge on George Washington. Washington knew the French would come for him, so he constructed a hastily made fort in the meadow he had camped at and called it Fort Necessity. Here, Washington made his heroic stand against the French who outnumbered him. In Washington's first major battle, Washington suffered a humiliating defeat. Realizing that the fort was completely insufficient and losing men rapidly from the overwhelming French firepower, Washington chose to surrender. When news reached London of Washington's surrender, the British were furious and immediately sent a British army to North America to deal with the French. Washington did not know it at the time, but he had just fired the first shot of the French and Indian War, a war that would only be a small part of a war that would span the entire globe, where the major powers of Europe would war with each other on Europe itself and in their colonies found all around the world. The wider war would be known as the 7 Years' War, and would be the first global war, and would leave over 1 million people dead. Future British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would call the 7 Years' War the First World War, while British politician Horace Walpole would comment, quote, "The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire," end quote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a young George Washington accidentally started a world war. Thanks for watching, and if you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.